The blood on my torn nightgown wasn't mine alone. It belonged to every child who ever trusted the wrong hands, every daughter who carried secrets too heavy for small shoulders. Tonight, as I sit beneath the flickering candlelight of my Georgia kitchen, my wrinkled fingers trembling over these pages, I finally break 50 years of silence. My name is Eleanor Rose Thompson. I am 78 years old and I am ready to speak. The kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows across our kitchen walls that night in May 1957, when Mama took her last labored breath in Daddy's arms. But the darkness that descended on our household wasn't from any storm brewing outside. It came from the man who shared our blood and our table, who said grace with calloused hands that would soon teach me that monsters don't always hide under beds. Sometimes they sit right beside you at Sunday dinner. "Take care of your siblings, Ellie," Mama had whispered as Daddy carried her to the truck, her fever-bright eyes meeting mine one final time. "I'll be back soon." It was the last lie she ever told. When Daddy returned alone that night, soaked by rain and grief, his shoulders bent like an old man's, I knew our world had shattered. Mama was gone. Caroline Thompson, who hummed while kneading bread and told stories that made wildflowers bloom in our imaginations, had been claimed by pneumonia in just one terrible day. Our simple wooden house, painted light blue with red geraniums on the porch, had been our haven. Daddy worked the cotton fields from sunrise to sunset, his hands growing harder with each season. Mama baked bread and pies to sell to neighbors, her kitchen always warm with the smell of rising dough and cinnamon. We were poor, but rich in the ways that mattered until that gray May morning when everything changed. I was the oldest at 10, responsible for watching Paul 8, and little Rosie barely 5. When Mama's cough turned harsh and wet, when her lips took on that blue tinge, I now know was cyanosis, our simple life cracked like an eggshell. "Mom, is everything okay?" I'd asked, frightened by the sight of her burning with fever. She tried to smile, but the effort seemed to cost her everything. "Just a bad case of the flu, my flower. It'll pass soon." But it didn't pass. By afternoon, Daddy was wrapping her in blankets and carrying her to the truck. "I'm taking Caroline to the hospital in Fairview," he told us, referring to the neighboring town with its small medical facility. "Ellie, you're in charge of the little ones until I get back." That's when Grandfather stepped forward. August Thompson had been living with us since Grandmama's death 8 months earlier. Tall and broad-shouldered even at 68, with hands calloused from decades as a farm foreman, he possessed the kind of quiet authority that made grown men step aside. His gray mustache was always perfectly trimmed, his calculating eyes always evaluating, always measuring. "I'll keep an eye on the little ones, Ernest," he said, placing his heavy hand on Daddy's shoulder. "Take Caroline, and don't worry about anything here." Now, 61 years later, I know that was the moment the trap was set. The day dragged on with agonizing slowness. I tried to maintain normalcy for Paul and Rosie, preparing a simple lunch of cornbread and beans, as Mama had taught me, inventing games to distract them from the awful quiet that had settled over our house. Grandfather remained on the porch most of the time, smoking his pipe and watching the relentless rain through calculating eyes. When he came inside to check on us, his gaze would linger on me in ways that made my skin crawl, though I couldn't have named why then. As evening darkened, my worry grew into panic. Where was Daddy? Why weren't they coming back? Around 7, I put my siblings to bed, Paul taking forever to fall asleep because he understood something terrible was happening. Rosie drifting off quickly after I told her one of Mama's favorite stories about the mockingbird who learned every song in Georgia. It was nearly 9 when I heard truck wheels in our muddy yard. I ran to the window, heart racing with hope, only to see Daddy emerging alone from the cab, soaked and broken. When he stumbled through our door, I knew immediately that my world had ended. His eyes were red and swollen, his normally strong body bent like that of a much older man. He held his wet hat against his chest, as if standing before a coffin. "Where's Mom?" I asked, though his devastated face had already given me the answer. "Your mother." His voice failed. He swallowed hard, then tried again. Caroline didn't make it, daughter. It was pneumonia very advanced. The doctor said there was nothing more they could do. The world tilted sideways. How could Mama be gone forever when she'd been alive just that morning, trying to smile despite her fever? How could someone so vital, so essential to our existence, simply stop being? Daddy pulled me into his arms, his wet clothes soaking my dress, but I hardly noticed. We stood there sharing a grief too vast for words, while Grandfather watched from the kitchen doorway, his face impassive as carved stone. The arrangements for the wake are already being made. Daddy finally managed. Tomorrow morning I'll bring her home. I need you to be strong, Ellie, for the little ones. I nodded through my tears, swallowing the pieces of my breaking heart. I had always been the responsible daughter, Mama's little helper. Now, I would need to be even more. "Shoo, go rest, son," Grandfather said to Daddy, his voice carrying that gentle authority I would learn to fear. The journey was long, and tomorrow will be difficult. I'll keep an eye on the little ones with Ellie. Daddy looked at me hesitantly, but exhaustion was etched in every line of his face. "Try to get some sleep, daughter. I know it's hard, but you'll need strength." I agreed, though I knew sleep would be impossible. Daddy retreated to the bedroom he had shared with Mama, and soon the muffled sound of his weeping penetrated our thin walls. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, while rain continued its merciless assault on our roof. The same table where Mama had rolled out biscuits that morning, back when the world still made sense. Grandfather sat across from me, pouring himself whiskey from the bottle we kept for visitors. "Take a sip," he said, extending the glass toward me. "It helps numb the pain." I hesitated. I had never drunk alcohol, and I knew Mama wouldn't approve. But Mama wasn't there anymore, and the agony in my chest felt like it would swallow me whole. The whiskey burned my throat, making my already streaming eyes water more. But it did dull something, so when Grandfather refilled the glass, I drank again. "That's right," he murmured, his voice taking on a strange softness. "Life is hard, Eleanor. Better to learn that early." I don't remember how many glasses I had. The room began to blur my thoughts, growing muddy and slow. At some point, Grandfather rose from his chair and approached me. "Come on, child, let me help you to bed." But he didn't lead me to the room I shared with Rosie. Instead, he guided my unsteady steps toward his own quarters in the back of the house. In my grief and confusion, I didn't question it. Maybe I thought it was better not to disturb my little sister with my crying. What happened next remained buried in the darkest places of my memory, for decades surfacing only in fragments that would wake me screaming in the night. Rough hands where they shouldn't be. Sharp pain tearing through my small body. Ignored pleas. The crushing weight of a large man on a frame too small to resist. The smell of whiskey and pipe tobacco mixed with hot breath on my face. Whispered words that would echo in nightmares for years to come. "Now you're the woman of the house." At some point, I must have lost consciousness because my next clear memory was of dawn. I was back in my own bed, lying beside Rosie, who slept peacefully, innocent of the new reality surrounding us. For a moment, I thought everything, Mama's illness, her death, what happened afterward, had been one cruel nightmare. Then I felt the physical pain, saw the finger-shaped bruises on my arms, noticed the bloodstain on the sheet. It hadn't been a nightmare. It was all real. My mother was dead. And on the same day I lost her, I also lost my innocence, my childhood, my trust in the world. In that moment, something inside me closed off like a steel trap. An iron gate descended over my emotions, locking everything inside, where it couldn't hurt me anymore. I got up carefully so as not to wake Rosie, changed clothes, washed my face in the basin we kept in the room. I looked at myself in the small mirror on the wall and saw a different person, still with the face of a 10-year-old girl, but with eyes that had aged decades in a single night. I went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast as Mama used to do. It was the day of her wake, and I knew the house would soon fill with neighbors and relatives. Normalcy was my only refuge, the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart. Daddy was already up, his eyes swollen, his face marked by a night of tears. He hugged me again, and I needed all my newly discovered strength not to break down in his embrace, not to scream the truth about what had happened. "I'm going to get your mother now," he said, his voice hoarse with grief. "Take care of the little ones when they wake up." I nodded mechanically. Take care of the little ones. That's what I would do from that day forward. Take care of the little ones and keep silent. Because who would believe me? Who would stand against the word of a respected man like my grandfather? And how could I bring more pain to my father, who had just lost the love of his life? So began my long winter of silence. The days following Mama's burial passed like dense fog over Georgia fields. The wake was a blur of familiar faces, hugs that couldn't warm me, and words of comfort that didn't reach my ears. I only remember the simple light wood coffin, Mama's face, too serene, as if she were a wax doll, instead of the vibrant woman who had hummed while kneading bread. I held my siblings' hands the entire time. Paul understanding enough to cry constantly, and Rosie too young to grasp the finality, repeatedly asking when Mama would wake up. Each question was a knife twisting in my chest. In our small community, grief had its rituals. The women took over our kitchen, filling our pantry with food that would last weeks. Homemade breads, pies, preserves, sausages, cheeses. The men helped Daddy in the fields, knowing he couldn't handle everything alone in those first difficult weeks. But the visits gradually decreased. Life has its own urgency, and people returned to their routines. A week after the burial, we were alone again, a father devastated by loss, 3 motherless children, and a grandfather whose eyes now followed me around the house like a predator stalking prey. Daddy, consumed by grief, barely noticed what was happening around him. He left before dawn and returned at dusk, falling exhausted into bed with no energy for anything else. Work was his only escape, the only way to endure Mama's absence. If he tired himself enough, maybe he wouldn't dream of her at night. "You're being such a good girl, Ellie," he would sometimes say, passing his hand over my hair. "Your mother would be proud." Those words should have comforted me, but they caused deep pain instead. If he knew what was happening when he was away, would he still look at me with that pride in his eyes? I assumed the household responsibilities as best I could. I woke early to prepare breakfast, helped my siblings dress for the rural school, 2 miles from home, washed clothes in the stone tank, cooked what I had learned from Mama. My small hands tried to recreate her gestures, but everything came out different. The beans never had the same taste. The bread didn't rise properly. The clothes weren't as white. Each failure was a painful reminder of her absence. At night, when everyone was asleep, I cried silently into my pillow, muffling my sobs so as not to wake Rosie beside me. I cried for Mama, for myself, for the weight of responsibilities too big for such small shoulders. But mostly, I cried for the terror that grew in my chest every time I was alone with Grandfather. After that first night, he became more careful, more methodical. He waited for moments when Daddy went to town on business, when my siblings were at school or playing with neighbors. There was always an excuse to call me to his room, to the tool shed, or to the bank of the creek that crossed our property. "Come help me here, Eleanor," he would say in that rough voice that allowed no refusal. And I would go, my body trembling, knowing what awaited me, but unable to escape. What choice did a 10-year-old girl have in a time when children had no voice, when the word of an adult, especially a respected man in the community, was unquestionable law? He always used the same words afterward. "This stays between us. Your father already has enough problems. You don't want to cause him more suffering, do you?" And so he silenced me, using my love for Daddy as a weapon against me. It was a cruel game of manipulation that I, in my innocence, had no way to combat. I truly believed that telling the truth would kill Daddy with grief, that it would be my fault if our family, already fragile from losing Mama, completely disintegrated. The months dragged on in this continuous nightmare. Winter came with full force to the south, bringing frosts that whitened the fields in the morning, and nights so cold we could see our breath inside the house. On the days when the wind was strongest, cutting to the bone, I almost appreciated the cold that allowed me to wear several layers of clothing, creating one more barrier between me and the hands that violated me. Over time, I learned to mentally absent myself during those moments. While my body was trapped there, my mind escaped far away to the stories Mama used to tell, to the green fields where we picked flowers in spring, to a distant future where I would be big enough to run away with my siblings. It was a form of survival, a dissociation that allowed me to endure the unbearable. In August of that year, when I turned 11, I realized with horror that my body was beginning to change. Small, painful buds appeared on my chest, announcing an early puberty that only worsened my situation. Grandfather noticed these changes with an interest that filled me with nausea. "Turning into a young lady, huh?" He commented one day, his eyes traversing my body in a way that made me want to disappear. "Your mother developed early too." I tried to hide the changes as best I could. I wore loose clothes, hunched my shoulders, bound my chest with tight strips of cloth under my shirts, anything to look smaller, less visible, less desirable to his predatory eyes. But it was useless. That summer, we began receiving frequent visits from Aunt Louise, a distant cousin of my father. A widow in her 50s who lived in town, she came on Sundays bringing cakes and sweets for us, observing our situation with attentive eyes that seemed to see more than others. "This girl is too thin," she commented to Daddy once. "And those eyes, they look like they belong to someone much older." It was the first time anyone had noticed something was wrong. I felt a mixture of hope and panic. Part of me wanted her to discover everything, to take that heavy secret away from me. Another part trembled with fear of the consequences of not being believed, of causing a storm in the family. Grandfather perceived the danger that Aunt Louise represented. He became more cautious when she was around, treating me with calculated distance that could pass for respect. But his eyes sent clear messages. No one would believe me. I had no choice but to remain silent. As time passed, I developed small acts of resistance. Small rebellions that probably went unnoticed by others, but represented important battles in the silent war I was waging. I began sleeping with scissors under my pillow. I started waking before everyone to lock the door of the room I shared with Rosie. I invented illnesses when I would be alone with him, but my greatest weapon was vigilance. Not the silence of the victim, but that of the observer. I learned to read the signs, to predict his movements, to anticipate his moods. I knew when it would be safer to be near other people, when it was better to hide in the hayloft of the barn, a refuge I discovered by chance, and that he never found when his mood was particularly dangerous. In March of 1958, almost a year after Mama's death, something happened that would change the course of our family history forever. It was a Saturday, I remember clearly. Daddy had gone to town to sell vegetables from our small garden and buy supplies. Paul and Rosie were at the neighbor's house attending a birthday party. I was alone at home with Grandfather cleaning the wood stove when he appeared at the kitchen door. "Come here, Eleanor," he ordered with that tone that had never allowed refusals. My heart raced. I knew that tone, that predatory look. But that day something inside me rebelled. Maybe it was the exhaustion of almost a year living in hell. Maybe it was the memory of Mama that seemed particularly vivid that morning. Maybe it was simply that my cup of tolerance had overflowed. "I can't right now," I answered, without looking at him, continuing to scrub the ashes from the stove with more force than necessary. "I need to finish this before Daddy gets back." He seemed stunned for a moment. I had never directly disobeyed before. But surprise soon gave way to anger. He crossed the kitchen in 3 wide steps, grabbed my arm with enough force to leave marks, and began dragging me toward his room. "Who do you think you are to answer me like that?" he growled through clenched teeth. "Forgot who's in charge here while your father's away." I fought him, trying to break free, scratching and kicking. It was useless against his adult strength, but I continued resisting anyway. Something had broken inside me. If it was going to happen anyway, at least I wouldn't be submissive this time. That's when we heard the sound of wheels in the yard. Grandfather froze, still gripping my arm with brutal force. We weren't expecting anyone at that hour. Through the kitchen window, I glimpsed the faded red of Daddy's truck returning far earlier than expected. Never had that battered vehicle looked so beautiful to my eyes. "Go see who it is," Grandfather hissed, abruptly releasing me and pushing me against the stove. And not a word about this understood. Grandfather quickly disappeared to his room while I tried to compose myself before Daddy entered, smoothing my apron, fixing my hair, breathing deeply to contain the tears that threatened to fall. Daddy came in carrying supplies and a small package wrapped in brown paper that I later discovered was fabric for me to make a new dress. His face, normally marked by sadness since Mama's death, seemed a little lighter that day. "I came back early," he explained, placing the groceries on the table. "Storm's coming. Thought it better not to risk getting stuck on the road." Indeed, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, heralding one of those summer storms that transform dirt roads into impassable mud pits. I helped him store the groceries, trying to act normally. But my arm throbbed where Grandfather had squeezed it, and my heart still beat erratically from the interrupted confrontation. Daddy observed me carefully as we organized everything. At one point, his hand touched my arm, exactly where the red marks from Grandfather's fingers showed. I instinctively recoiled with a moan of pain I couldn't contain. "What's this on your arm, Ellie?" he asked, furrowing his brow. "Nothing," I answered quickly. "I hid it when I was cleaning under the table." He didn't seem convinced. His eyes, so similar to mine, the same ones I had seen age prematurely in the mirror, studied my face for a long moment. "Is something happening that I should know about?" he finally asked, his voice soft but firm. The words stuck in my throat. It was my chance to tell everything to end that nightmare. But fear of disbelief of consequences of destroying what remained of our family paralyzed me. "No, Daddy." I lied, lowering my eyes so he wouldn't see the truth in them. "Everything's fine." He sighed, seeming unconvinced, but didn't insist. Instead, he briefly caressed my hair before going to find Grandfather. The first thunders began sounding in the distance, announcing the imminent storm. Inside me, another storm was forming, one made of guilt for not having taken advantage of that opportunity of relief, for having escaped that time, and of a new feeling I took time to recognize hope. Daddy had noticed something. He had asked questions. Maybe, just maybe, not all was lost. What I didn't know then was that the real storm in our family was just beginning to form on the horizon, about to break with a force that would change our lives forever. The days following that interrupted confrontation were filled with almost palpable tension. Grandfather, for the first time, seemed cautious around me, casting glances that mixed threat and apprehension. Daddy, in turn, observed us with renewed attention, as if he had awakened from a long trance of mourning. Something had definitely changed in Daddy's behavior. He began arriving earlier from work in the fields, asking questions about our day, noticing small details that before had gone unnoticed in his fog of pain. Sometimes I caught him observing me with a questioning expression, as if trying to decipher an enigma written on my face. Other times, I caught him in whispered discussions with Grandfather, conversations that abruptly ceased when I entered the room. The house routine followed its apparent course. I continued caring for the house and my siblings, cooking, washing, sewing, but something subtle had changed in the family dynamic. The opportunities Grandfather found to be alone with me drastically decreased, not for lack of attempts on his part, but because Daddy seemed to always be nearby at critical moments, appearing unexpectedly when least expected. What I didn't know was that Daddy had been conducting his own investigation. Late at night, when he thought everyone was asleep, he had been searching through Mama's belongings, looking for something, anything that might explain the growing unease he felt about his own father. It was during one of these nocturnal searches that he found a small leather journal hidden beneath Mama's side of the mattress, a diary she had kept sporadically over the years. Most entries were mundane recipes, reminders, small observations about daily life. But there were other entries, darker ones, that made Daddy's blood run cold. Entries about grandfather's visits to her room when she was young. About a pregnancy she had lost at 16 after he forced himself on her. About the fear she had carried all these years, the reason she had never wanted to be alone with him, the secret shame that had haunted their marriage. The final entry, dated just a week before her death, contained words that would burn in Daddy's memory forever. I pray every night that August will never look at Ellie the way he once looked at me. But I see it, starting that calculating hunger in his eyes when he watches her. God help me, I think I'm dying at the worst possible time. Armed with this terrible knowledge, Daddy began watching more carefully, noting things he had been too grief-stricken to see before. My flinching when grandfather entered a room. The defensive way I held my body. The nightmares that made me cry out for my dead mother in the night. On a particularly cold April evening, when autumn was painting the Georgia leaves gold and crimson, Daddy decided to set a trap. He announced at dinner that he would be going out after dark to check on a problem with the fence in the far pasture, a job that would keep him away for at least 2 hours. Paul and Rosie were already asleep, exhausted from a day of play. I was finishing the dishes when grandfather made his move, but Daddy hadn't gone to the pasture. He was waiting in the shadows of the porch, watching through the kitchen window. Alone, Eleanor. Grandfather's voice sounded low and predatory behind me. The familiar chill of dread ran down my spine. I nodded without turning around, my hands mechanically continuing to dry the dishes as if normalcy could protect me from what was coming. It's been a while since we've had a moment just for us, he continued, approaching. I could feel his whiskey-tainted breath on my neck. Your father's been very watchful lately, hasn't he? His heavy hands landed on my small shoulders, and I felt my legs weaken. I already knew what would come next, the same nightmare that had been repeating for almost a year. I closed my eyes tightly, searching for that distant place in my mind where I usually took refuge during these moments. What the hell do you think you're doing? Daddy's voice cut through the kitchen like a whip crack. I opened my eyes to see him standing in the doorway, his face transformed by a fury so pure, it seemed to burn the air around him. Grandfather stepped back as if he'd been burned, removing his hands from my shoulders. Nothing, son, he answered with false casualness. Just talking with the girl. Talking. Daddy's voice was deadly quiet. That's not what it looked like to me. A dense silence descended over the kitchen, broken only by the crackling of wood in the stove. I remained frozen, the half-dried plate still in my hands, unable to move or speak. Go to your room, Ellie, Daddy ordered without taking his eyes off grandfather. I hesitated for a moment, torn between relief at being able to escape and fear of what would happen when I left. Go, he repeated more firmly this time. I dropped the plate and dish towel and quickly passed by Daddy toward the hallway. But instead of going to my room, I stopped in the darkness of the corridor, my heart hammering so loudly I feared they could hear it. What were you doing with my daughter? Daddy's voice carried a dangerous edge I had never heard before. I already told you we were just talking, grandfather replied, but his voice carried a subtle tremor. Am I imagining things? Daddy's tone became even more menacing. For weeks, I've been watching you two. The marks on her arms, the way she cringes when you come near, the nightmares at night. She's a clumsy girl, always hurting herself. And as for the nightmares, she lost her mother. It's normal. Don't take me for an idiot. Daddy's voice exploded, making me shrink in the darkness. I know exactly what you are now. I found Caroline's diary. A stunned silence followed those words. Even from my hiding place, I could feel the shock rippling through the kitchen. That's right. Daddy continued, his voice shaking with rage and grief. My wife wrote everything down. What you did to her when she was young. The pregnancy she lost because of you. The fear she carried her whole life. Ernest, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, Daddy roared. And her final entry, written just before she died, was about her fear for Ellie. She saw what I was too blind with grief to notice, that you were already starting to look at my daughter the same way you once looked at her. The girl confuses things, Grandfather said, his voice taking on a wheedling tone. She needs guidance, and since she doesn't have a mother, she has a father! Daddy's voice cracked with fury. And that father is going to protect her from monsters like you. What happened next was chaos incarnate. Grandfather lunged forward, perhaps trying to grab the diary to destroy this evidence of his decades of evil. But Daddy was ready. His fist connected with Grandfather's jaw with a sickening crack that echoed through the kitchen. They crashed into the table, sending dishes flying in all directions. Grandfather, despite his age, fought like a cornered animal, but Daddy's protective rage gave him strength beyond his normal capabilities. This wasn't just about me. It was about Mama, about every secret violation, about all the innocence stolen by those same hands, now clawing for survival. I pressed myself against the wall of the hallway, watching in terror and wild hope as they wrestled across the floor. Grandfather managed to grab a heavy iron skillet from the stove, swinging it at Daddy's head. Daddy ducked the pan, whistling past his ear, and drove his shoulder into Grandfather's stomach. The impact sent them both crashing into the wood stove. Grandfather's head struck the corner of the cast iron with a hollow thud that seemed to echo through the entire house. He crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath his skull, his calculating gray eyes finally mercifully going dark. The sudden silence was deafening. Daddy knelt beside the motionless form, his hands shaking as he checked for a pulse he would never find. Go wake Paul, he ordered, without looking at me, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. Tell him you didn't hear anything, that you were sleeping. No matter what happens, you saw nothing. Understand? I nodded, understanding completely. We had both done what needed to be done. And Ellie, Daddy added, holding my shoulders with gentle hands that still trembled from righteous violence. One day, when you're older, I'm going to ask you what really happened in this house. And on that day, I want you to tell me everything. But not today. Today, you saw nothing. I promise, Daddy. The hours that followed were a careful orchestration of necessary deception. The sheriff arrived with the town doctor, examining the scene with practical eyes that saw what they needed to see: an elderly man who'd had too much to drink and slipped on the kitchen floor, striking his head on the stove. Could happen to anyone. Sheriff Barnes concluded, his weathered face showing neither suspicion nor surprise. Especially after a few shots of whiskey. Sad business, Ernest, but these things happen. Maybe he truly believed the official story. Maybe he simply understood that some secrets were better left buried, that justice sometimes wore unexpected faces. Either way, the verdict was established. August Thompson, 69, had died from an accidental fall. The funeral was sparsely attended only by duty rather than genuine grief. A few townspeople, some former colleagues of Grandfather's. No real tears were shed, no heartfelt eulogies given. My father remained stoic throughout, fulfilling social obligations with the dignity of a man, doing what must be done rather than what he desired. I watched them lower that simple pine coffin into Georgia soil and felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Evil was being buried that day, along with secrets that would never surface again. That night, after my siblings had fallen asleep and the house had finally returned to peace, Daddy and I sat at our scarred kitchen table, the same table where everything had ended and begun again. "I won't ask you to tell me what happened," he said quietly, his calloused hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long grown cold. "I don't want you to carry that burden any longer than you already have. But I want you to know that if I did what I did, it was because a father protects his children always, no matter against whom or what." He reached across the table and took my small hand in his work-hardened one. It was the first time we had really talked since Mama's death, since the nightmare began. "Your Mama's diary told me everything I needed to know about that man. What he was, what he did to her when she was just a girl herself, what he was doing to you." For the first time in almost a year, tears fell freely down my cheeks. Not tears of fear or shame, but of relief so profound, it felt like resurrection. "We both did what needed to be done," I replied, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "And we're alive. That's what matters." Daddy looked at me with something approaching wonder, as if he were seeing me clearly for the first time. "You're strong like your mother," he said softly. "She would be proud." In that moment, sitting in the gentle lamplight while spring rain washed our sins clean, something new formed between us. Not just the bond of father and daughter, but the alliance of survivors who had faced evil and emerged victorious. Life has a strange way of moving forward even when it seems impossible. The summer of 1958 arrived with its typical southern intensity, bringing scorching days and sultry nights. But despite the relentless heat, something inside me slowly began to thaw, as if an internal winter was finally giving way to a hesitant spring. Daddy, though we never again directly discussed what had happened that night, began rebuilding our family with silent determination. He took on not just the role of provider, but tried in his awkward country way to fill the void left by Mama's absence. His calloused hands, accustomed to rough field work, now attempted delicate gestures, braiding Rosie's hair in the morning, checking Paul's homework after school, even making simple cakes on Sundays, using Mama's yellowed recipes. "Your father's turning into a housewife," neighbors would joke when they discovered he had learned to bake bread and mend clothes. He would just smile without embarrassment. "My children need it, so I learn," he would simply respond as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Though in 1958, in rural Georgia, it was almost revolutionary for a widower to take on such tasks. As for me, while I continued helping with household chores, Daddy insisted I return to school regularly. "Your mother wanted you to study," he would always say whenever I tried to argue that I would be more useful at home. "And I want that too." The return to our one-room rural school, where students of various ages studied together under Miss Martha's guidance, was both relief and challenge. Relief to be away from home for a few hours, among people who didn't know, who would never know what had transpired within our wooden walls. Challenge, because at 11 years old, I carried experiences that irremediably separated me from other children. "Eleanor seems to be in another world," Miss Martha would comment in meetings with Daddy. "She has potential, learns quickly, but always seems distant, as if part of her were somewhere else." She was right. Part of me was always on guard, always vigilant. The trauma had taught me never to completely lower my defenses, to always look for escape routes, to distrust easy smiles and unexplained kindnesses. At night, nightmares continued, though less frequently. I would wake screaming, my body covered in cold sweat, terrible images still vivid behind my eyelids. In the worst moments, it was Daddy who came sitting on the edge of my bed and patiently waiting until my breathing normalized. "It's all right, Ellie," he would whisper in the darkness. "It was just a bad dream. Nobody is going to hurt you. Never again." He never asked what I dreamed about. It wasn't necessary. We both knew. In early 1960, when I was 13, life presented us with another opportunity for change. Aunt Louise, that distant cousin who had sometimes visited, was widowed from her second husband. Childless and alone in her large house in town, she proposed something that would again alter our lives' direction. "Ernest," she said one Sunday after lunch while we drank sweet tea on the porch. "I've been thinking about this for a long time. Why don't you come live with me in Fairview? The house is too big for me alone, and the children would have access to better schools." Daddy hesitated, running his hand over his poorly shaved chin. "I don't know, Louise. This land is all I have. It belonged to my father and his father before him." "Nobody said anything about selling," she responded pragmatically. "Hire someone to take care of it. Come on weekends. Think of the children, Ernest. What future do they have here? Eleanor is almost a young lady. She needs proper schooling if she doesn't want to end up as someone's housemaid." That touched Daddy deeply. If there was anything he ardently desired, it was for his children to have opportunities he and Mama never had. The decision wasn't made that day, but the seed was planted. Over the following months, the idea grew discussed countless times at our dinner table, weighing pros and cons. Paul and Rosie were excited about the prospect of living in the big city, which was really just a slightly larger town of approximately 5,000 inhabitants. I had mixed feelings. The idea of leaving the house where so much suffering had occurred was tempting. But despite everything, it was the only home I knew. Every corner, every tree in the yard, every stone on the path to the creek contained memories, some painful, yes, but others precious, from happier times when Mama was still alive. In July 1960, in the middle of a harsh winter, we made the move. We didn't take much: some clothes, personal objects, family photographs, the porcelain set that had been Mama's. The rest stayed behind along with a part of ourselves. Aunt Louise's house in Fairview was truly large by local standards. 2 stories with 4 bedrooms, a living room separate from the dining room, a spacious kitchen with both a wood stove and a gas one, a modernization that impressed us enormously, and even an indoor bathroom with running water, a luxury we had never experienced. "Each child will have their own room," announced Aunt Louise to Paul and Rosie's delight, who had always shared cramped spaces. Adapting to our new life wasn't simple. Daddy, accustomed to physical work in the fields, now had a job at a local store working the counter and making deliveries. His hands, once calloused from the hoe, now handled ledgers and calculated accounts. In the first weeks, he would return home with a lost expression, as if he didn't know exactly who he was in this new reality. As for me, I was enrolled at Our Lady of Grace School run by nuns. It was completely different from the rural school. Separate classrooms by grade, multiple teachers, specific subjects, impeccable uniforms, strict rules. On the first day, looking at those dozens of girls in their pleated skirts and starched white blouses, I felt a fear I hadn't experienced since the dark times in our old house. "You'll get used to it," Aunt Louise assured me, adjusting my navy blue tie for the 3rd time. "It's one of the best schools in the region. A diploma from here opens doors." I said nothing, but doubted I would ever get used to belonging to that world. The other girls came from established families in town, daughters of merchants, the pharmacist, the notary, even the mayor. I was the girl from the countryside, with a heavy accent and rustic manners, wearing a second-hand uniform that Aunt Louise had obtained from an acquaintance. The first months were of almost total isolation. I always sat at the back of the classroom, spoke only when directly questioned by the nuns, avoided recess by staying in the library under the pretext of studying. It wasn't just shyness, it was a protective barrier I had erected around myself, an invisible wall that kept the world at a safe distance. Academically, however, I flourished. I discovered in books a refuge, an alternative world where I could escape from reality's complications. Sister Cecilia, the literature teacher, was the first to notice my talent for writing and reading. "You have a gift with words," she told me one afternoon after reading an essay I had written about the place I came from. I had described the undulating fields of our property, the clear creek water, the yellow ipe trees that exploded in color at winter's end with a vividness that surprised her. "You should consider being a teacher someday," It was the first time someone suggested I could be more than a housewife, more than a continuation of Mama's destiny. The idea planted itself like a fragile seed in infertile ground, but which against all odds began to germinate. At home, our new family dynamic also found its rhythm. Aunt Louise, though energetic and sometimes excessively practical, had a generous heart. She treated us as if we were her own children, with a peculiar mixture of discipline and affection that, to my surprise, worked well. "A girl your age needs to learn more than studying," she would say, teaching me to crochet on winter nights. "She needs to know how to manage a house, sew a button, make a cake that doesn't look like a brick. But she also needs to know mathematics so as not to be cheated in accounts and read good books to have her own opinions." It was a vision of femininity, halfway between traditional and progressive for the time, especially in rural Georgia in the early 60s. Aunt Louise wasn't revolutionary. She didn't openly advocate that women should have careers instead of families. But she firmly believed that an educated woman made better choices in life. Daddy, meanwhile, seemed to slowly rejuvenate. The weight he had carried on his shoulders since Mama's death, aggravated by the incident with Grandfather, began to diminish. He started smiling more, telling stories during dinner, playing with Rosie, and helping Paul with his studies. Occasionally, on Saturday nights, he even went to movies with colleagues from the store, a socialization he would never have considered in our previous life. It was on one of these Saturday nights when I was 15 that Aunt Louise and I had the conversation that would change my understanding of what had happened in our old house. We were alone at home. Daddy had gone out with Paul to see a movie at the town's only theater. Rosie was at a friend's birthday party. Aunt Louise was crocheting while I read a book Sister Cecilia had lent me. "Eleanor," she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between us. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you for a long time." I raised my eyes from the book, noting the unusual seriousness in her tone. "What is it, Aunt?" She put the crochet aside and looked at me directly. "What really happened with your grandfather?" The question hit me like a bucket of cold water. In all those years, absolutely no one had asked this directly. It was a silently forbidden topic, a ghost that hovered over our family, but was never named. I hesitated, feeling my throat suddenly dry. "He slipped and hit his head on the stove. It was an accident." Aunt Louise continued looking at me with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see through my carefully constructed facade. "Eleanor," she said gently, "I know what it's like to carry secrets that eat at you from the inside. I know what it's like to protect others by remaining silent about things that should never be silent." Her voice carried a weight I had never heard before, a pain that resonated with my own. "When I was your age," she continued, "I also had an older relative who thought he had the right to touch me in ways he shouldn't. And like you, I thought that keeping quiet was protecting my family. The shock of her revelation left me speechless." Aunt Louise, so strong, so sure of herself, had been through something similar. "The difference," she continued, "is that I never had someone brave enough to stop him like you did." "I didn't stop him," I whispered, tears beginning to burn my eyes. "I never said anything. I never fought back." "Oh, my dear child," Aunt Louise said, getting up and coming to sit beside me on the couch. "You did more than you know. Your father told me what really happened that night. Not the details, those are yours to share if and when you choose. But he told me enough for me to understand that his father was a monster and that you survived something no child should ever have to endure." The tears I had held back for so long finally began to fall. Not the silent tears I cried into my pillow at night, but deep, liberating sobs that seemed to come from the very core of my being. Aunt Louise held me while I cried, her hand stroking my hair in the way Mama used to do. For the first time since that terrible night, I felt truly safe in someone's arms. "It wasn't your fault," she whispered. "None of it was your fault. You were just a child who lost her mother and was preyed upon by someone who should have protected you. Over the following weeks, slowly and carefully, I began to tell Aunt Louise my story. Not everything at once, some memories were still too painful, too raw, but piece by piece, like a puzzle being assembled. She never judged, never showed shock or disgust, never suggested I should have done anything differently. She simply listened, offering comfort when the memories became too heavy, encouraging me to continue when I felt strong enough. Healing isn't a destination, she told me one evening after a particularly difficult conversation. It's a journey, and like any journey, you take it one step at a time. It was through these conversations that I began to understand that what had happened to me didn't define me. I was more than a victim. I was a survivor. And survivors, Aunt Louise taught me, have a choice. They can let their experiences destroy them, or they can use them to build something stronger. As I entered my final years of high school, I threw myself into my studies with renewed determination. If Sister Cecilia was right, if I truly had a gift with words, then I would use that gift. I would become a teacher, not just because it was a respectable profession for a woman, but because I understood the importance of protecting children, of being someone they could trust. When I graduated as valedictorian of my class in 1965, Daddy cried openly during the ceremony. "Your mama would be so proud," he whispered as he hugged me afterward. "You've become everything she dreamed you could be." But my education didn't end there. With Daddy's support and a scholarship I had earned through my academic achievements, I enrolled at the State Teachers College. It was my first time living away from family, my first taste of true independence. College was challenging in ways I hadn't expected. Not academically, I had always excelled in my studies. But socially, I struggled. The other girls seemed so carefree, so untouched by real tragedy. They worried about dates and dances and fashion, while I carried secrets that made me feel decades older than my 18 years. It was during my sophomore year that I met Anthony. He was a medical student 3 years older than me doing his clinical rotations at the local hospital. We met at a church social, one of the few events I actually attended, dragged there by my roommate who worried about my hermit-like tendencies. Anthony was different from other young men I had encountered. Quiet, thoughtful, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When he asked me to dance, I almost declined. Physical closeness still made me uncomfortable, still triggered memories I tried to keep buried. But something about his gentle manner, his respectful distance made me say yes. "You seem very serious for someone so young," he observed as we swayed to the music. "I suppose I've seen more of life than most people my age," I replied, then immediately regretted revealing so much. But Anthony didn't pry. He simply nodded, as if he understood that everyone carried their own burdens. Our courtship was slow, careful, respectful. Anthony seemed to instinctively understand my need for boundaries, my occasional moments of unexplained panic, my reluctance to be touched without warning. He never pushed, never demanded explanations I wasn't ready to give. It was 6 months before I told him about my past. We were sitting by the college lake on a warm spring evening, watching the sunset paint the water gold and pink. I had been carrying the weight of my secrets for so long, and something about the peaceful setting, about Anthony's patient presence, made the words tumble out. I told him everything about Mama's death, about grandfather's abuse, about that terrible night when it all ended. I spoke in a rush, afraid that if I stopped, I would lose my courage entirely. When I finished, Anthony was quiet for a long time. I stared at the water, afraid to look at his face, afraid of what I might see there. Disgust, pity, the desire to run away from someone so damaged. Finally he spoke. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said simply. "I know it couldn't have been easy to share. You must think I began, but he interrupted gently. "I think you're the strongest person I've ever met," he said, "and I think that monster got exactly what he deserved." When I finally looked at him, there was no pity in his eyes, no disgust, only admiration and something deeper that I was almost afraid to name. "Does this change things between us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes, he said, and my heart sank. But then he continued, it makes me love you more. It makes me want to spend the rest of my life making sure you feel safe and cherished and valued. We were married 2 years later, in 1968, in a simple ceremony at the little church in Fairview. Daddy walked me down the aisle, tears streaming down his weathered face. Aunt Louise, now officially my stepmother since she and Daddy had quietly married the previous year, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Paul and Rosie, now young adults themselves, served as our attendants. It was a small wedding, intimate and perfect. Our early marriage wasn't without challenges. Intimacy remained difficult for me, and Anthony's patience was tested more than once by my nightmares, my sudden panics, my need for control in situations that reminded me of my powerlessness as a child. But he never gave up on me, never made me feel broken or inadequate. When I woke screaming from nightmares, he would hold me until the terror passed. When crowds made me anxious, he would guide me to quiet spaces. When certain touches or positions triggered memories, he would stop immediately, no questions asked, no frustration shown. We have our whole lives, he would remind me. There's no rush. Slowly, carefully, we built our own version of intimacy, one based on trust, communication, and absolute respect. It wasn't the passionate romance of movies or novels, but it was real and healing and ours. In 1970, our first child was born. Charles Ernest, named for my father, entered the world on a snowy February morning after 18 hours of difficult labor. The moment they placed him in my arms, something shifted in my universe. This tiny, perfect being was completely dependent on me for protection, for love, for everything. Looking down at his wrinkled face and tiny fingers, I made a silent vow that would guide the rest of my life. I will protect you, I whispered. Nothing and no one will hurt you as long as I live. 2 years later, Mary Caroline joined our family, named for my beloved mother. She was easier delivery, a calmer baby, but she filled the same overwhelming protective instinct in my heart. Motherhood transformed me in ways I hadn't expected. All the maternal instincts that had been awakened too early when I cared for Paul and Rosie, all the protective fierceness that had been forged in trauma, now had their proper outlet. I threw myself into being the mother I had always wished I could have kept longer, present, attentive, fiercely protective, but not overprotective. I finished my degree through correspondence courses and night classes, determined not to let marriage and motherhood derail my education. In 1972, I began teaching at Fairview Elementary School. Walking into my first classroom, looking at those rows of eager young faces, I felt a sense of purpose I had never experienced before. These children, some confident, some shy, some clearly carrying their own hidden burdens, were now under my protection. I became known as a teacher who saw everything, who noticed the child who was too quiet, too jumpy, too eager to please. I learned to read the signs I knew so well, the flinching at unexpected touches, the hypervigilance, the way some children seemed older than their years. Over my 37-year career, I identified and helped 14 children who were being abused at home. 14 young souls who might have been lost if someone hadn't been watching, hadn't been willing to ask difficult questions, hadn't been brave enough to make the hard phone calls. Not all the cases were as clear-cut as mine had been. Sometimes it was neglect rather than outright abuse. Sometimes it was emotional rather than physical harm. But each time I saw myself at that age, frightened alone, carrying secrets too heavy for small shoulders, and I acted. The first case was the hardest. 8-year-old Sarah Mitchell, who came to school with bruises she claimed were from falling downstairs. But I recognized the finger-shaped marks on her arms, the defensive way she held her body, the terror in her eyes when her father came to pick her up. Making that first call to Child Protective Services was terrifying. What if I was wrong? What if I was seeing abuse where there was only clumsiness? What if the family was destroyed because of my suspicions? But then I remembered Aunt Louise's words. Sometimes the greatest harm comes from doing nothing. I was right about Sarah. Her stepfather had been beating her for months. She was removed from the home and placed with relatives who loved and protected her. Years later, she came back to visit me, a successful nurse with children of her own. "You saved my life," she told me simply. "You saw me when no one else did." Each successful intervention gave me more confidence, more determination. I developed relationships with social workers, police officers, counselors, building a network of people who could act quickly when a child was in danger. At home, I was equally vigilant with my own children. I taught Charles and Mary about body safety from an early age, about the difference between good secrets and bad secrets, about the importance of telling trusted adults when something felt wrong. "Never let anyone hurt you," I would tell them. "And if someone does or tries to you, tell me immediately. I will always believe you, and I will always protect you." They grew up confident, secure, knowing they were loved unconditionally. Charles became fascinated with medicine, perhaps influenced by his father's career. Mary showed early signs of my own protective instincts, always standing up for younger children, always noticing when someone was sad or scared. The years passed in a rhythm of teaching, parenting, and slowly continued healing. Anthony's medical practice thrived, and we became pillars of the Fairview community. On the surface, we appeared to be the perfect family, successful, respected content. And in many ways, we were. But healing is never a straight line, and some wounds leave scars that occasionally ache. There were still bad days triggered by anniversaries or news stories, or simply inexplicable chemistry in my brain. Days when the past felt more real than the present, when I could still smell whiskey and tobacco, still feel rough hands where they shouldn't be. On those days, Anthony would come home to find me sitting motionless at the kitchen table, lost in memories I couldn't escape. He never asked questions, never demanded explanations. He would simply sit beside me, take my hand, and wait until I was ready to return to the present. "Where did you go?" he would ask gently when my eyes cleared. "Somewhere I don't want to be," I would reply, and that was always enough for him. In 1980, we received news that would test our family's resilience once again. Daddy, now 63 and officially retired from farming, suffered a massive heart attack while working in his garden. By the time the ambulance reached him, it was too late. His death devastated me in ways I hadn't expected. Despite everything we had been through, despite the terrible secret we shared, he had been my protector, my champion, the man who had saved me when I couldn't save myself. At his funeral, I stood beside his grave and whispered words only he would have understood. "Thank you for being brave enough to act. Thank you for believing me without me having to say a word. Thank you for showing me that love is stronger than evil." Aunt Louise, now in her 70s but still sharp and determined, moved in with us after Daddy's death. She became the children's beloved grandmother, the woman who taught Mary to sew and showed Charles how to make his grandfather's famous cornbread. It was Aunt Louise who suggested I consider sharing my story more widely. "You've helped so many children one at a time," she said during one of our evening conversations. "But imagine how many more you could reach if you spoke publicly about what happened to you." The idea terrified me. Speaking to groups of teachers or social workers about recognizing signs of abuse was one thing I could do that without revealing personal details. But sharing my own story, making myself vulnerable to public scrutiny, was something else entirely. "People need to hear from survivors," Aunt Louise pressed gently. "They need to know that healing is possible, that victims can become victors." It took me 2 years to work up the courage, but in 1983 I gave my first public speech about childhood sexual abuse. It was at a conference for educators, a room full of teachers and administrators who dealt with at-risk children every day. My hands shook as I approached the podium. My voice trembled as I began to speak. But as I told my story carefully, choosing my words to educate rather than sensationalize, I saw the recognition in the audience's eyes. Some were seeing their students in my words. Others, I suspected, were seeing themselves. After my speech, a line of people waited to talk to me. Teachers sharing their concerns about specific students. Administrators asking for resources and training. And most importantly, other survivors' adults who had carried their own secrets for decades, thanking me for giving voice to their experiences. That first speech led to others. I began speaking at conferences, workshops, training sessions. I testified before legislative committees working to strengthen child protection laws. I consulted with schools developing abuse prevention programs. Each time I told my story, it became a little easier. Not because the memories became less painful, but because I saw how my pain could be transformed into protection for others. The work wasn't without cost. Reliving trauma repeatedly, even in service of helping others, took its toll. There were periods when I had to step back to focus on my own healing and my family's needs. During one particularly difficult time in the late 1980s, when nightmares had returned with a vengeance, and I was struggling with depression, Anthony gently suggested I might benefit from professional counseling. "You've spent your whole life helping others heal," he said. "Maybe it's time to let someone help you?" Dr. Patricia Williams was a trauma specialist who had recently opened a practice in the county seat. Our first session was awkward, uncomfortable. I was used to being the helper, not the one seeking help. But gradually, through months of careful work, I began to process parts of my experience that I had never fully examined. The guilt I still carried about not speaking up sooner. The anger at Mama for dying and leaving me vulnerable. The complex feelings about Daddy's violence, even though it had saved me. Trauma isn't something you get over, Dr. Williams explained. It's something you learn to carry differently. Your goal isn't to forget what happened, but to integrate it into your life story in a way that empowers rather than defines you. The therapy helped, but what helped even more was watching my children grow into confident, capable adults. Charles graduated medical school and specialized in pediatrics, drawn to healing children, just as I had been drawn to protecting them. Mary became a lawyer specializing in advocacy for abuse victims and their families. I always knew I wanted to help kids who couldn't help themselves. Mary told me when she passed the bar exam. "Growing up with you showed me how important that work is." In 1995, our family faced another major loss. Anthony, always the picture of health, began experiencing fatigue and weight loss that he initially attributed to the stress of his busy practice. When the diagnosis came, pancreatic cancer already advanced, our world shifted once again. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of treatments, hopes, disappointments, and gradual acceptance. Anthony faced his illness with the same quiet dignity he had brought to everything else in his life. "I'm not afraid of dying," he told me during one of our last real conversations. "I'm only sorry I won't be here to grow old with you." He died on a quiet Tuesday morning in March, holding my hand as the sun streamed through our bedroom window. His last words were characteristic. "You are the strongest person I've ever known. Don't forget that." Widowhood at 58 was not something I had prepared for, despite decades of helping others through loss. The house felt enormous and empty without Anthony's steady presence. The bed seemed too big, the evenings too long, the future too uncertain. Charles and Mary, both now established in their careers and starting families of their own, worried about me living alone. But I wasn't ready for assisted living or moving in with family. This house held too many good memories, too much of the life Anthony and I had built together. Instead, I threw myself into volunteer work with renewed dedication. I joined the board of the county's domestic violence shelter. I helped develop curriculum for child abuse prevention programs in schools. I mentored young teachers who were dealing with difficult cases. The work gave me purpose, but it was the arrival of grandchildren that truly restored joy to my life. Charles and his wife gave me 2 grandsons, little Anthony, born in 1997, and James, born in 2000. Mary and her husband had 3 children, twin girls Sarah and Emma, born in 1998, and a son David, born in 2002. Being a grandmother was different from being a mother. With my own children, I had been hypervigilant, always watching for threats, always ready to spring into protective action. With my grandchildren, I could relax into pure enjoyment of their company. They knew me as Grandma Ellie, the woman who made the best apple pies in Georgia, who told the most interesting stories, who always had time to listen to their problems. I chose not to burden them with the darker chapters of my history, preferring to let them see me as I had become, rather than as I had been damaged. But I was still watchful. I still taught them about body safety, still listened for the subtle signs of distress, still maintained my network of contacts for when families needed help. The years passed peacefully. I aged into the role of respected elder, the white-haired lady who sold pies at the farmer's market and never missed Sunday service. To most of the community, I was simply Mrs. Thompson, the retired teacher, who had dedicated her life to children's welfare. Few people knew the full story of how that dedication had been forged in the fire of my own childhood trauma. In 2010, at the age of 73, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I decided to write a book about my experiences. "Why now?" Mary asked when I told her about the project. "Because I'm running out of time to tell the story," I replied. "And because there are still children out there who need to know they're not alone." Writing the book was harder than any of the speeches I had given. Putting the full truth down on paper, crafting it into a narrative that would help, rather than merely shock, required me to examine my experiences with brutal honesty. I worked with a collaborative writer, a young woman named Jennifer, who specialized in trauma narratives. Together, we shaped my story into something that could serve as both witness and guide. Broken No More. A Survivor's Journey from Victim to Advocate was published by a small press in 2012. I never expected it to reach a wide audience. It was enough that it existed, that my story was permanently recorded for anyone who might need to hear it. But something about the book resonated with readers. It was picked up by a larger publisher than another. Soon, I was receiving letters from across the country from survivors sharing their own stories, from parents seeking guidance from professionals working with trauma victims. The letters were both heartbreaking and inspiring. A woman in her 60s writing to say that reading my story gave her the courage to tell her own family about abuse she had suffered 50 years earlier. A young teacher describing how the book helped her recognize signs in one of her students. A teenager thanking me for showing her that survival was possible. Each letter reminded me why I had chosen to break my silence, why the pain of reliving trauma was worth it if it helped even one person feel less alone. Now, at 78, I live quietly in the same house Anthony and I shared for over 4 decades. My children visit regularly, bringing their families for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. My grandchildren, now teenagers and young adults, still come to me for advice and comfort. My body has aged. Arthritis makes my fingers stiff. My hair has gone completely white. My voice sometimes shakes with emotion when I speak about the past. But my spirit, tempered by decades of healing and service, remains strong. I still volunteer when my health permits. I still speak occasionally at conferences, though I'm more selective about engagements now. I still answer letters from readers, though my responses are shorter and less frequent than they once were. Most mornings, you can find me on my front porch sitting in the same rocking chair where Aunt Louise used to crochet. I watch the sunrise paint the Georgia sky in shades of gold and pink, and I reflect on the long journey that brought me to this peaceful place. It wasn't an easy path. There were years of pain, decades of healing moments when I wasn't sure I would survive the weight of my own memories. But I did survive. More than that, I thrived. I think about Mama sometimes, wondering what she would think of the woman her little girl became. I think she would be proud that I used my pain to protect others, that I found the courage to speak truth, even when it was difficult. I think about Daddy, and how his split-second decision to act saved not just me, but potentially countless other children I was able to help over the years. Violence is never the answer, but sometimes it becomes the only answer when all other protections have failed. I think about grandfather, and I feel something I never expected to feel: pity. What had made him into a predator? What trauma in his own childhood had twisted him into someone who could hurt the people he should have protected? I don't excuse his actions. Nothing can excuse what he did to Mama, to me, to who knows how many others. But I can acknowledge that evil is often born from evil, that hurt people often become people who hurt others. The cycle ended with him. It will never continue through me or my children or their children. That may be my greatest victory. As I sit here in the gathering dusk, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance across my lawn, I think about the message I want to leave behind. Not just for the survivors who might read my story, but for anyone who faces darkness in their own life. You are stronger than you know. You are more loved than you can imagine. Your story is not over yet. The monsters are real. They sit at dinner tables and say grace and call themselves family. But so are the heroes. They come in the form of teachers who notice neighbors, who care strangers, who listen families, who choose love over silence. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the heroes look exactly like you survivors, who found the courage to not just endure, but to transform their pain into purpose. If you're reading this and you see yourself in my story, know this: you are not alone. You are not responsible for what was done to you. You have the power to write the next chapter of your life. Speak your truth. Somebody is listening. Fight for your healing. Somebody is cheering you on. Survive and then thrive. The world needs your light. My name is Eleanor Rose Thompson. I am 78 years old. I am a survivor, a mother, a grandmother, a teacher, an advocate. I am no longer silent.